an ceol stopula de hell. Jeeve gach dinna fáilte roth Majin Mai. It gives me great pleasure as Moira Leydon, Vice President of the Labour History Society, to introduce the gender dimension to the whole story of labour in Irish history and history in Irish labour. And our apologies for a slight delay in starting. As I said, as Vice President of the Society, I think it's really great to have this item on the agenda so early in the proceedings. Yesterday at the keynote address, I was very taken by the first image that Marcel put up, and it was photographs of different forms of work, some of them with slave labour, some of them in the factories, some of them in modern computers, but right in the middle he had a photograph of a woman up to her elbows in suds in the sink. And he was making the point that labour and gender are absolutely inextricably entwined. And of course now we have a very substantial body of scholarship and labour history writings on the care work as real labour, love labour. Professor Kathleen Lynch from UCD, Professor Emeritus now, was one of the, the people who led the way in Ireland, excuse me, in focusing on unpaid work as labour and the way our societies, and indeed the very nature of work in modern society, is framed around the concept that we have a whole lot of unpaid labour going on in the background in terms of caring for the young, caring for the old, taking children to school, that whole notion of social and cultural capital. So it gives me great pleasure to bring Sarah Ann from Cork, O'Ducas, Kanisha Gobrig, Ulskan Legalyov.
You definitely recognise my voice anyway. So I was given what initially didn't look like a difficult brief until I started to work on it. This talk is very much a talk about historiography. It's a talk about debates. It might bring up some old wounds, but sure aren't we all? We love that. And it's very much about, I suppose, where we've come and where we're maybe going. So just to say first, I published my first academic article in Seher in 2008, and I was very proud to act as co-editor with Francie Devine, Brian Hanley, Martin Maguire, and I know a lot of people will say stuff about the journal the next few days, but I teach in a history department, and I have to say it is incredibly useful and important from an academic level. And that's some of the stuff I'm going to talk about today, where Seher, where the Irish Labour History Society and academia meet or don't meet. But I want to acknowledge the journal and the work and the tireless work that goes into that by many people in the room. So I spent the last few weeks reading and rereading a lot. Gender history, labour history, social history, contributions from women, about women, history from below, debates on agency, debates on women and work, what constitutes work that is not paid, on women and class. And in 30 minutes, I can only touch on some of these issues. And I'm probably going to talk a bit more about the bigger trends, because I think that's useful for us going forward, and it's useful for future scholars in this space. And I really want to kind of, this slide, the reason I put it up is there are a lot of spaces, like each one of the things I've put on this title slide, from the index to Seher, to probably the first book that was acknowledged that was published on women in Irish history, women in Irish society, the Field Day anthology, which caused a lot of controversy in the early 90s, our more recent bibliography of Irish women's history, the Roisin Conroy collection. I put these up to show the many ways that we are intersecting across these disciplines. So my brief is to discuss from 1980, but I'm actually going to start with the publication of the Index to Seher, which was published in 2000 and produced by Francie Devine, which many things are that I will talk about today. And in the index, Professor Jolie was asked to reflect on the Irish Labour History Society and to reflect on Seher and its place in Irish historical studies. Quote, "There was, of course, labour history before Seher, but there was very little systematic study of the labour movement and even less of working class life. So a number of the points that Joe raised are, I believe, still very relevant. The role of activists in producing labour history, the development of Irish history within the academy and within universities, and the composition of the academy, the growth of women's history, feminist history, and gender history, and the increasing focus on histories from below. But also, there is a question about how marginalised groups are treated in more recent scholarship, and I'll come back to that later. Lee also addressed the question as to who were the working class in Ireland, debates that many people in this room have had. He pointed, of course, to the agricultural labourer and saw this as possibly a reason why there had been less of a focus on some of the labour history publications. Interestingly, Francis Devine wrote in his piece about the first 25 years of the society, and he reflected on perhaps oral history not having as much of a place as he would have imagined, and I'm going to come back to that. On the academy, the question was raised as to why there are very few dedicated labour history modules in universities. Lee astutely responded with the line, quote, "Irish historians are themselves products of their country's history." I've been sitting with that one for the week, I'll just say that much. The concern with Anglo-Irish relations, the limited number of historians, the amount they had to cover, the emphasis on political history, and outside the tenant-landlord relationship, the perhaps lack of class analysis. Women in labour history were not exactly part of the earlier grand narratives. In 1991, David Fitzpatrick wrote in Irish Historical Studies, quote, "Gender, until recently, failed to engage the attention of historians of modern Ireland," highlighting how the first article to be published on women's history appeared in its 99th issue. It's good to get in there before the 100th, I always think. Discussing the tension between women's history and labour history, Lee further reflected, quote, "The growth of women's history, inevitably focusing disproportionately initially on the careers and aspirations of middle-class women, diverted attention from working-class lives." Now, just to say, lots of people in this room were part of these debates and the tense moments. The Saher was very quick to include women or accommodate women's history in its journal, and I'll be going through some of that in a few minutes. So in 1986, when gender was put forward as a, quote, "useful category of analysis" by Joan Scott, Irish historians To Scott, gender was not only a useful category, it also helped women's history to earn legitimacy in an often hostile academy. For many in women's history, the concern was it would deflect from the work of feminist historians. Heteronormativity, the positioning of the family in the Constitution, and the overtly masculine nature of Irish nationalism, coupled with the conservatism of Catholic social teaching, have had a very deep impact on how history was written from 1922 until the late 70s. What women's history, feminist history, and later gender history have offered is a critique of existing power structures, both in the past and in the present. So Saher, I was calling this the women of Saher, some women of Saher, and there's about 5 really important ones missing because they come up later on. So what was the trajectory of work being produced? In Saher, while most editions did only contain 2 to 3 representations from women, they were present early, and they were working on issues of class, labour history relating to women. This is not an exhaustive list, but an example of who was engaging with the society and the journal. I initially compiled a spreadsheet of women involved per issue, and then I realized that life is too short. One of the first pieces to address women in work was in 1981. Mary E. Daly's essay, "Women in the Irish Workforce from Pre-Industrial to Modern Times." She highlighted the economic role of women being under-recognised, the position of unmarried women caring for relatives, and acknowledged that, quote, the low status afforded to women's work had far-reaching consequences. Addressing the stigma around women who did work, she discussed how a situation of need, in no way due to self-fulfillment, if you enjoyed your job, that was not acceptable. By the 1930s, as Arnsberg and Kimball commented, this meant a rural female class who, quote, acquiesced in a subordinate status. Marriage was key. Not marrying was treated with hostility for the 1 in 4 women who do not do so in the 1930s. In 1983, Rosemary Owens published Votes for Women, or Votes for Ladies, Votes for Women. This article addressed some of the tensions that we are a lot more familiar with now around class, around the involvement of many middle-class women, around the question of suffrage or votes, the universal vote. She also looked at the organised labour and suffrage movement and explored this relationship in more detail. In the same issue, Hazel Morrissey's Oral History of Betty St. Clair addressed the life of a woman born into a Protestant working-class family in Ardoyne. In 1987, Owen O'Neill wrote a piece on the INTO and the marriage bar. And Therese Moriarty's review of Unmanageable Revolutionaries and Smashing Times, called Rescue and Recovery, Women in Irish Labour History, still holds lessons today. Moriarty writes, quote, women's history shares a number of disadvantages and approaches with labour history. Its state of exclusion, nowhere more marked than in Ireland, where the study of labour history is new, began around the same time as the first researches into women's history, and is still struggling to be accepted as a mainstream field of inquiry in the academic world or publishers' catalogues. Anna Davin, in her essay on feminism and labour history, argues for a broad definition of labour history and, quote, the contribution and interrelation of all the different kinds of work. Our late start could be an advantage. Irish labour history is less institutionalised than in other countries. Adding the feminist perspective to our history not only will deepen our understanding of the past, but also offers, in the key words of Raymond Williams, quote, almost every kind of imaginable future. The excellent work continued in Sayre. Margaret Crawford on diet and the working classes. Carla King's review of Mary Jones's excellent book. Work by Anne Matthews, by Louise Ryan. The Irish Citizen newspaper, which is still incredibly useful to scholars today. And not only address questions around suffrage and the vote, but raise for the first time issues of violence against women and children, the Watch the Courts Committee in particular, and raise that question as to the types of lives that many working class women were living. I'm going to talk now about one particular review, Mary Daly's review of 3 books in 1994, before I move on or back to the new agenda for Irish women's history. Daly initially addresses the controversy over the exclusion or perceived exclusion of women from Roy Foster and J.J. Lee's monographs and the Field Day controversy. She states, and the review is about Mona Hearn's book, it's also Alva Smith's book, and it's Joanna Burke's book. Quote, as both of these texts concentrated, and these are the history texts, or sorry, these are Foster and Lee's texts, as both of these texts concentrated on high politics and related issues, such as nationalism and unionism, plus in the case of Lee, an analysis of the success or failures of the independent Irish state, it could be argued the omission of women's history is hardly surprising, as women played, at best, a marginal role in these areas. She is also clear to differentiate between the 2 history books from the Irish Women's Studies reader, stating, both are refreshingly free of feminist jargon. The word patriarchy, for example, appears in neither index. The books are given the credit they both deserve, whereas the reader receives 1 paragraph, and Daly concludes with, it is, I suggest, time for research concerning women to leave the ghetto and join the establishment. reluctance to do so may be taken as evidence that women wish to remain as second-class citizens. In Irish history, we were also learning more, and this is the mainstream history, about the experience of everyday women. Economic history was slowly growing, as was social history. By the 1990s, we knew that women's paid work had steadily declined from the 1850s until the 1980s. Unpaid labour, or unrecognised labour, was a large part of women's work. Gender roles had remained remarkably static until the 1970s, and it was generally accepted that, quote, the match and dowry system was widespread in Ireland by the 1980s, irrespective of religion or geography. As the last talk, the fantastic talk by Rebecca pointed out, the wages of women, girls and juveniles were pitifully low at the beginning of the 20th century, and they were the focus of many as being seen to also drive down the male breadwinner wage. For the most part, married women held a greater status than single women, and issues of huge concern to feminists from the 1970s, violence against women and children, was a feature of all time periods. The, quote, priest, peasant and patriot, Crowd Fintan Lane and Donald O'Driscoll, were a feature of many women's lives. In May 1992, Irish Historical Studies published an agenda for women's history in Ireland, co-authored by Margaret McCurtain, Mary O'Dowd and Maria Luddy. The, quote, agenda offered an evaluation of the state of the discipline in Ireland, possibilities for future research, a blueprint for future generations. It covered the two key time periods, 1500 to 1800, and Maria Luddy focused on the 19th century. They were extremely critical of Irish scholarship, arguing that, quote, the predominant methodology of Irish historiography is not only unsympathetic to incorporating the history of women, but by its very nature excludes women. Thankfully, since 1992, the number of scholars working on women and gender's history has increased significantly, and this cohort is continuing to grow. Today, we know the necessity to provide an intersectional understanding of women's lives shaped by gender, but also by social and economic class, race and ethnicity, disability and sexuality. Much of the work of Irish women's history was to write women back into the historical narrative so they may rightly reclaim the spaces they occupied in revolution, politics and domestic spheres as fighters, thinkers, confidants and breadwinners. It has come a very long way since Scott published her reflective piece in 2010, revisiting her 1986 chapter. A large body of research, monographs, articles, influential edited volumes has emerged, and scholars could publish in women's history with less fear of being excluded from academia. Arguably, there has been greater emphasis on class and histories from below than more traditional labour histories, but the Irish labour history bibliography shows us the wealth of work that is being done on trade unionism and on women in trade unionism. It shows us the wealth of local histories, of micro-histories that are tackling women's participation, not just at a national level, but in the granular level. Now, I've skipped all my slides. Some of them are slightly... Jolie's code is in no way a critique. It's just to remember where we were and also to highlight some of the work that was coming out at that time. So Mary Daly's excellent book, Women in Poverty, Joanna Burke's Husbandry to Housewifery, Elizabeth Keeley and Moira Leanne's Irish Women at Work. Now, I said at the start that oral history was a really big part of this. I'm going to do the last 5 minutes on where I think we need to go, but I think this is an excellent example of how important it is to, in instances where we are not going to get the recollections, we are not going to find in the traditional archive the voices of women and how their lived experience was, to ensure that oral history is a part of it. Women in Work in Ireland, Women Surviving, Below Stairs, Unmanageable Revolutionaries. These were amazing books to come through. And I want to make particular note to Attic Press, which I mentioned at the start, and later Ireland House. And I just took these two documents from the archive in UCC because, as many of you know, Roisin Conroy worked in the 1970s with the ITGWU, and there was a real emphasis on that piece around women's history, and these two documents in particular relating to the Women's History Project and to the Society's symposium are, I think, really relevant to show how involved the Society was in this piece. The other we have is Alva Smith, Two Sides of Ireland, where she's discussing how the press came about, how they ended up producing books like Margaret Ward's The Missing Sex or June Levine's Sisters, or many of the texts that you're aware of in this room. So, as I said, women's history, gender history, labour history, and women. I'm going to come back to that. These are some of the texts that have been published, just some, over the last few years. There has been an explosion. A lot of it is perhaps more in the vein of social history, but it certainly has class at the centre of its investigation. It also has been a move towards, I suppose, the life course more generally, and not just looking at the adult life course or the working life course, but looking at children, looking at relationships, looking at old age. So there's a lot there, I think, that we can be really grateful for. I also think that it's certainly moved away from the debates around the inclusion of women and gender, but it is still very difficult to look at volumes that come out where you just still have the section of women and. That's still what you have. And that's not to, I've edited, I know how hard it is to find or to put yourself out there and try to have that diversity, but we need to move past the women and piece. Gender isn't just an add-on. We need to start looking through the lens of gender and class the whole way through. I have put the institutions down. I said I would talk about what I know about. I know about the history of institutions in Ireland, and I think that it is relevant in a labour history context. I think the unpaid work, I think the class of individuals that were often placed in the institutions deserve further attention. And it's not 2 or 3 institutions, it's up to 200 institutions. I think oral history, and credit to the Oral History Network of Ireland and individuals in this room, is still incredibly important. I think there's a big question around access to the archive. I'm not talking about the archive here, I'm talking about our national archives, and I'm talking about resources, and I'm also talking about what we do have access to equally. So the privileging of access and the archive. And I have given a presentation on women and gender and labour history with very little discussion of religion. And I think the question there as to how religion is being approached today and the history of religion is an interesting one. Now, the Society here was always very good at discussing the curriculum, the secondary school curriculum. And I'd like to hear the views from the audience on this. But I think that's still a conversation that needs to happen in academia. There needs to be a conversation about how we can have some influence on the curriculum, on secondary school, on primary school, because we often distance ourselves. I started with a conversation around the academy, and I suppose I meant it. When Jolie was discussing in 2000, he was right. There were times when historians were teaching 300 years of history. There was 2 of them in a department. We're probably coming to a point where we are shrinking again. And I think it's important to continue to discuss the relevance. If that means that we have someone with labour history, unfortunately I'm going to lose my colleague John Cunningham to, at least in the department over the next few years, will that post be replaced? This is a really important conversation because I'm not sure it will. Medieval history certainly is seeing the effects of the neoliberal university. I'm going to end with, I was reading a review of Politics and the Irish Working Class, and the reviewer said about Maria Luddy, she had her chapter on 200 years of women in trade unionism, and the reviewer said there's a lot more questions in this than there is information. And I thought to myself, yeah, but maybe that's the point. There's still a need for those histories, and they're in the ILHS bibliography. Those micro histories, those local histories of women in trade unions, that should be one concise history. That's not for me, that's for this room and the people in it. But women in trade unions, we know how relevant they are now today. So that has to have a place, so that hopefully the next time we see that, the male reviewer won't be able to comment on all the questions that are being left. Now, I was going to finish with a quote from a friend of mine, Elaine Feeney, who is currently longlisted for the Booker Prize. So, but actually, I think I've probably disrupted things enough. So I'm gonna leave it at that. And thank you all for listening. And I'm really happy to take any comments or questions. Thanks.
Please do give us her quote, because she's fascinating.
If I read history lesson, you'll either cry or you'll throw something at me. But okay, her word. I'll do it at the end.
Okay, so just maybe I have to say a few
Yeah,
words.
sorry.
Thank you, Sarah. That really was so engaging, and you just said, "I'd love to be a student in your lecture hall." It's just engaging, informative, and you absolutely raised more questions than answers, which is exactly what a good presentation should be. I'm going to invite some comments from the audience, but I just want to make one or two comments of my own. I'm an Assistant General Secretary with the ASTI, and I'm very, I suppose, embarrassed to a certain degree by your reference to the curriculum. I mean, we have, I think personally, that we have an excellent model of curriculum development in Ireland. We're the only country in the world, actually, which has a statutory body which brings together all of the partners in education, from parents to ICTU to the unions, management bodies, special educational needs, Educate Together, around a table, and they co-create a curriculum, which is really a very democratic process. And of course, with democratic processes, there are tensions, there are compromises, etc. And the same model of co-creation, that's the governance level, but the same model of co-creation exists, for example, at the History Development Group. And we're delighted on behalf of the Society, I can say, we have present at our conference this weekend, we have the Chief Inspector for History, we have the Assistant Chief, the Deputy Chief Inspector for History, the former Chief Inspector, and the Director of History in the National Council of Curriculum and Assessment present with us, and we're certainly going to follow up. But I quite agree with you. I mean, history, in fact, I was kind of smiling bemusedly when you quoted Jolie as saying history is gender, much of the early writings on gender was middle class. Well, you could throw the same critique back at male historians. Most of those were middle class as well. So I don't think that's a critique that holds up at all. But so that's the curriculum. The other thing I wanted to say, which I thought you really emphasised, was the neoliberalism and its impact on the academy and on not only the capacity of departments and schools to maintain their staffing, but also on the, shall we say, the downgrading of the humanities in the universities. And that sounds like almost a trope at this stage. We're so used to it, we've almost come to accept it. But I think when you hear academics like Sarah Ann standing up in front of us and making those observations, we really should start to get concerned, because it is going on at pace. And I mean, our universities now have metrics which are more suited to the boardroom than to cultural knowledge and essentially democratic institutions. So thank you for bringing that to our attention. So I'm a little bit badly prepared this morning, you must excuse me. Is there a roving mic, or will people be able to speak from the floors? Can we take some questions? And you might just identify yourself and your interest, so to speak. There isn't a roving mic, is there?
I have the mic. I'll just speak. John Martin. I am a member of the retired members group in Forza. But what I'm speaking, and it may be helpful to yourself, I'm a member of the organisation called the Community Action Tenants Union. We have just launched our documentary and the history of the 50 years last strike with the National Association of Tenants organisation. We have done the oral history. We have gone into every archive. Your colleagues in Maynooth and Trinity College have been very helpful to that. We have gone out, they have gone out themselves, not me, and done the oral history of the working class women and men throughout the country, the 32 counties. It's absolutely in a documentary, a film as we call it.
Yeah.
We hope to be able to get it plenty of traction and plenty of support. And I think in that you will see that the working class women in the social area on the rental basis, they were 90% of the activity and the strikes and their contribution to women's causes. It's absolutely, I have to be honest with you, and I will send it to you now that I have your things.
Yeah, do.
But certainly, and anybody else that wants it, I actually have a package here now that I'm going to give to the presidents of the Historical Society to see can we work together to actually move this on. The only thing we haven't been able to do is to get anybody the finances to actually put it in the book.
Okay.
And I think there are many organisations, through this organisation, the ICTU, other organisations, and people like yourselves may help us to get that off the ground. But certainly from what you have said and the history that is missing, you know, from that point of view, this, in my personal opinion, can be a major contribution to your work and the work of anybody, especially on the women's question and on the question of working class women and the role that they have played within their communities, within their societies, outside the trade union movement and outside the political movement. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thank you. I'd offer the money, but it's being recorded, so you'll come back for it.
Good morning. My name is Brian Sutherland. I'm here with Equity Northern Ireland, but I'm actually speaking personally just by myself. And I would like to apologise if I offend anyone with these questions. Why I agree with completely everything you've said about how women feel like they're second-class citizens, women in the labour market, and they're being stayed at home. There's one topic I think you haven't really covered on or looked at. Women were not second-class citizens in the past. We had, in Ireland, women queens. We had women leaders, the great job markets. Women had rights to divorce themselves if they didn't agree with their husband. The Barra laws. What changed? One subject. When Christianity rose in Ireland, women's rights plummeted. So when you have the feminist movement, the vote for women's laws, I don't see them as needed. I see them as necessary to reclaim what they had in the past. And nowadays, in the 1980s and 1990s, with the new feminist movement coming back, I'm struggling to see why people are having any issue with it when it's just women's trying to get back what they've lost. So I think it was just a recent poll that religion is now decreasing in Ireland, and as religion decreases, women's rights are rising again. And I'm just wondering, is there any correlation between, that trend, if that makes sense?
Just to go back to the Brehon laws and that narrative, now, not a medieval historian, but I do know, and actually I recommend a podcast by Niamh Wycherley. We just did one. It was a very small number of women. So we kind of have to put that over there in a way, because it was in itself a minority of women had those rights. So for the most part, we have experienced, if we're talking about a collective, a large group of women, progress. Up and down. I'm also just discussing Ireland. I'm not discussing other contexts. The second question was that women's rights and men's rights. I didn't hear it was women's rights are going up and
I find
which rights are going down?
When for women get more rights, religion is going down. The more young people are not believing in religion, and you see now more freedom of expression from gay rights, abortion rights, and women's rights are rising. And I'm just wondering, in Ireland, is there any correlation between the young folk losing religion and them gaining their rights back, if that makes sense?
Do I think secularization? Yes, of course. Because the Catholic Church and other churches would not feel that women have equal rights. So if you believe in equal rights, then it's not gonna sit so much with you. So I primarily just focus on women gaining legislative rights, and I focus on I suppose, the histories of women who were more marginalised. That's just that's why I discussed the institutions. Now, some people would argue when I talk about the institutions, that's having an impact on the Catholic Church today, which that's out of my
Oh yeah, I'm completely
control.
with you. I just feel that when religion got a stronghold in Ireland, it basically put women in a wee box. And that's
did,
why they've
yeah,
only been in certain industries, certain markets, is because what they were allowed by the book. And nowadays, when the young folk in the 80s are abandoning the book, if that makes any sense, the rights are now coming more and more they're demanding the rights back, which I'm all for. But I'm just wondering, do you feel that they need to be looked at was too much put on schools and education on the religious part that forced people to believe what they were, I can only do this job because I'm told to by the book, if that makes sense.
I think you have loads. I would direct you to everything on the screen because you've got a lot of
We have some other
topics
hands in
there.
the audience as well. Thank you. Thank you very much. That's a really important contribution.
Oh, thanks. Thanks, million.
So, Nova, Ella, or Clay over here to the left, please.
Hello, Martin.
Hello, Martin Maguire, fellow historian. A point that strikes me is that in Irish history we tend to be quite provincial. Is that happening as well with women's history? And what led me to that thought was family history, where in earlier generations the women's experience and choices they made was influenced in the 1920s and 30s by their sisters or other women in America, which came upon it. In the post-Second World War period, it was with experience with women in England, and particularly the growth of the welfare state. I know from family history, a young woman who trained as a nurse being urged very strongly by other women to get out, because if she stays, she will not have a career, but if she goes to England, she'll have a great career, which she did. So do we need to expand the field of vision, the horizon, and internationalize Irish women's experience, or do we need to, should we still keep it within the Irish context? I'd be interested in your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think like Jennifer Edmonds' book, Moving Histories, or a lot of the work on migration and women has been like I think a lot about expectations lately. So and even some of the work that's been done now in the history of emotions, like what are people actually, what's their expectations for their life? And then you give a talk like this, and I think about like my grandmother in Mahini, who taught me about downstairs, upstairs, which I didn't really know what she was doing there. Or my grandmother down in Bear Island, who, we talked about the 8 kids, had the 10 kids and the quite isolated life. And you think about expectations and how they've risen, but of course, migration and those stories are a huge part of that. I think we have to go, we published a volume recently, Gender in History, and it was actually directed at South Asian students. So it's quite, and it's because, of course, we have to look globally at some of the issues, because we learn stuff in Irish history about our methodology and approach if we're looking, more broadly. So definitely, I think expectations are, that's like the title of my next book I haven't written, Youthful Expectations.
Great expectations. Thanks, Martin. And that's a point actually that Marcel yesterday also he made the point that we have to look at the history in a very transnational and international perspective. So I think you're touching a chord there. Any other contributions, please? Here in the front.
Yeah. Feminist women, gender. Yeah. It's some of the debates, but the history of masculinity is starting to grow here, and I think that's only but I think that there's still a place for a feminist approach to the, personally. But yeah, no, the history of masculinity is definitely growing, and it can only benefit. It can. And similarly, groups like more marginalised groups, ethnically, like the history of LGBTQI+, like the Queer History Archive, the history of Irish travellers, Minkers, this is all going to just benefit all of our, and then we all get to turn around. Like, I will always hold my hands up and go, I completely missed where were the Irish travellers in my first study. Why didn't I say, oh, and just because they did not have a fixed abode, they were completely targeted by the cruelty man. And I did that, but you can evolve, I hope, as a historian, and you can put your hands up and go, yeah, I missed that. I need to go back. I need to do that work, I guess, yeah. So, yeah.
Thank you. Somebody else at the back, that's possibly now we're running out of time. Is there a hand up?
Carol, a woman.
And is there a mic, Moby?
Yeah, I have a mic here. Yeah.
Great, thanks.
And thanks, Sarah Ann. That was really brilliant and very thought-provoking. And I think I'll also be living with J.J. Lee's quote, Irish historians are themselves products of their country's history. And I'm wondering, do you think that he was reflecting just on the importance of land and the constitutional question, or was he reflecting on the factors that shaped who was in the profession? Because that seems to be the obvious thing.
I think I'm going to hope it's that, and I think maybe I'll write to him, but I think it is that too. Mm-hmm. I think it's who's in the profession as well. We've obviously seen an opening up of that.
Yeah, I'm wondering what you think sorry, I'm Carol Houlihan, I'm from Trinity. I'm wondering what you think about, you were talking about the number of appointments and how that's getting more difficult. There's been huge diversity since 1997 with free education, and we're seeing the impact of that now in the very questions that are being asked within Irish history. But I guess my concern with so-called free education, because I know it isn't entirely free, but the postgraduate fees for MPhils and master's programs are horrendous. And I've noticed in 10 years the difference in who I'm getting into a master's class, which again will affect who is going to be a historian. Yeah. So I guess we have kind of structural issues.
I worry about that. If it's, like we should say, if it's 5,000-6,000 a year, if education becomes a privilege again and not a right, then that's really worrying, because who will let the likes of me and you in again, Carol, if we're not, I think that is important, yeah.
Great, well I think, Caroline, we're at 11, and I can see my INTO colleague here anxious in the background. He's on next. So I just want to say thank you so much. That was really engaging. Makes you want to go back to college, absolutely. And I'm sure your slides will be eagerly awaited for their circulation. So I just wanted to major just a small appreciation of the quality and the delivery of the morning.